Within the next 2 weeks, the Federal Aviation Administration will start shutting down 149 air traffic control towers across the country. It's almost 30% of America's air traffic control towers. Thank you, sequester. Yay. To explain what this all means for airlines and pilots and passengers, we are joined by Andy Bender, a Forbes contributor, Andrew Clark, an FAA contractor, Robert Poole from the Reason Foundation, a libertarian non-profit, Robert McKenzie, an attorney and recreational pilot, and Paul Rinaldi, president of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Andy, you wrote an article about this. Just explain to us exactly what's going on.
Yes, well, it all started with the sequester, which is a law that went into place in a budget deal back in 2001. The sequester effects were supposed to take effect at the beginning of this year, but that ended up being postponed until March 1st. Basically, it mandates across-the-board cuts for pretty much every branch of the federal government. The FAA's share of that is about $637 million. And the easiest way for them to make those cuts, they reasoned, was to shut down airport towers that were controlled by contractors, contract employees. I mean, 149.
Why are they bearing such a large proportion of the cuts to the Department of Transportation?
You know, there are parts of the DOT that are off limits. That even though the cuts were supposed to be across the board, large parts of many branches of the federal government were exempted from these cuts, and the Department of Transportation was one of those. In effect, the FAA has about a 20% share of the DOT's budget, and it's being responsible for 60% of the cuts.
Right. Andrew, you're being personally affected by this. Just explain your situation.
Sure. So I'm not directly related with the tower situation. However, I am working for one of the largest programs within the FAA called Terminal Automation, Modernization, Replacement, which is going into national airports installing new radar systems. And I'm personally working in Washington, D.C. as a project management analyst, and recently found out that I'm without a job come Monday morning.
Right. How did you take the news?
Okay. I received the word on March 6th, so I've had a few weeks to do a job search, but I'm finding it frustrating that I was told so abruptly and without really any indication of from the federal side as to what was happening with my contract until very last minute. And now seeking new employment opportunities, preferably in the same field, but recognizing that can be very hard right now.
Paul, you're the president of the union that governs all this. Just explain to us from your perspective what's going on.
Well, I wish I could explain sequestration. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Perhaps I'm asking too much of you. You don't have to actually explain you explain Washington politics. No one can do that. But
yes.
Explain the implementation of this particular procedure.
Well, under sequestration, the FAA has to cut somewhere about $647 million out of their operations budget. And they have till September 30th to do it. So they're looking at the quickest way they could stop contracts and shut down contracts and start to actually save money to reach this mandated spending savings that they have to get to. The air traffic controllers in the 149 towers are going to be out of jobs, and that's a big problem.
Why is it a big problem? Just explain that to us, because a lot of people wouldn't realize, of course, that smaller airports don't have air traffic control towers. An airport can still remain open without air traffic control towers. Pilots can still use visual means to see one another and so on, and to communicate with one another using radio. Why is the air traffic control tower always necessary?
Well, you know, it's a good question. And depending on the volume of traffic, it's not always necessary. Depending on hours of operation, it's not always necessary. But you know, they build these big, you know, multi-million-dollar towers there because air traffic control is not a luxury that you can just cut out when you need extra money. It's a necessity to run a safe, orderly, and efficient operation inside the airport terminal zone. So that is a big problem. We look at that and say, we're going to have to reduce capacity at a lot of these airports because you're not going to have the second set of eyes that are going to be able to scan the taxiways and the runways. You're not going to be able, in some airports that have crossing runway situations or parallel runway situations, a unicom frequency is not the most efficient way or the most accurate way to control traffic. So that's when it really becomes a problem. In the federal sector, the air traffic controllers are looking at an 11-day furlough, 1 day each pay period starting on April 21st, which is then going to restrict the capacity of the national airspace system. Also, we're not going to be able to run, triple arrivals into our larger airports where the capacity is just going to be less. This is certainly not the way to treat the economic engine of the national airspace system. 10 million jobs are contributed to the airspace system. $1.3 trillion go into our economy every year because of this system. This is going to be devastating to everybody involved. It's our way of life.
Just clarify for people the difference between FAA-operated air traffic control systems and the ones that the FAA contracts out, because I think lay people wouldn't be aware that there are two different types of employees that we're talking about here.
There are two different types of employees, and I've heard some negative rumblings that, well, the reason the FAA is doing this is because those employees are not represented by the union. That's the furthest thing from the truth. We represent a large portion of those towers that they're closing, those 149 towers, and we're in the process of negotiating that now.
But just to clarify, right, the difference is that those towers aren't run by the FAA; they're contracted out. The FAA
no, they're run by private corporations.
Yeah.
That the FAA bids out a contract with the FAA. Very similar to like the TAMR or ERAM or other type of corporations that they deal with Lockheed and Raytheon, and they provide a service at airports that the FAA were not providing. But it was deemed necessary that we need service in these airports.
Robert McKenzie, one of the crazy things about this is that actually the FAA-operated airports are less efficient than the ones that are contracted out. But because of rules, of course, about furloughing people and so on, it's much easier for the FAA to dismiss and fire people who are just contractors. So they're actually firing the more efficient people, and they're keeping on the less efficient people.
That's true, actually. Yeah, there's been a lot of press that's out there lately, and articles, especially from the Government Accountability Office, that have been cited, talking about the differences in efficiency between contract towers and non-contract towers. The contract towers are handling approximately 28% of the operations, but they're really only making up about 14% of the budget. So it is kind of interesting that that's where the cut has to take place on one of the more efficient aspects.
And I mean, you're a pilot yourself. When you think about coming into land, some people talk about safety issues here. I'm not. Anytime I hear safety issues, I think that's probably untrue in a system that is as secure and as regulated as the U.S. aviation industry is. But do you think that there are safety concerns coming into land at an airport where there's no air traffic control?
I absolutely do. And from a pilot's perspective, I think it really focuses on traffic integration, right? If we have a small airport with a group of single-engine airplanes, we don't have a lot of trouble sorting ourselves out. We communicate on radios. We have recommended best practice procedures to get in and out of the traffic flow. It's very easy to make that work, and we do it really well. When you start to add jets and airliners into that mix, you've got a disparity between speed, a disparity between size, disparity of maneuverability, and that traffic flow gets a lot more difficult to manage. So even though we still use those best practices and make do with what we have at the non-controlled fields, it can throw a wrench into the system to have somebody coming in fast and hot and heavy versus some of the smaller airplanes. And the towers really do a great job of directing that traffic and make sure that we integrate well.
Just talk us through the process of coming into land at when you're dealing with air traffic control at an airport that has a mix of both small recreational aircraft and large jets. What happens?
Well, it's actually kind of interesting. So we'll use the tower at airport, for example. Most of the time when it's just a tower, you're calling as a single engine or a small plane, you're calling about 10 to 15 miles before you reach the airport to let them know that you're inbound and that you plan to land there. The jet traffic, the faster traffic, is frequently on IFR flight plans. They're a little bit farther out in the system, and that tower is going to have advanced knowledge that that traffic is coming in. So as these the jets start to come in, and as the single engine and the smaller planes start to come in, the tower controllers start to organize who's going to come to the airport first. They tell you both how to enter the pattern. There's a traffic pattern that circles the airport. They also tell you what your position is going to be to land. So they act a lot like a traffic officer does in an intersection, right? Who goes first? Who goes next? How do we best sequence these planes in? And they start that process with the jets many miles out, and with the smaller planes about 10 to 15 miles out.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. Just talk to us about smaller airports. I mean, one of the interesting things that I noticed here was that some of these big jet airliners, they're starting to look at the congestion at these big airports, like here in the New York City area. Frontier, for example, which is a Denver-based low-cost carrier, they've just they're really going heavy on Trenton, New Jersey, which is a small airport, and they're thinking, look, maybe there's a market amongst people who live in New Jersey who don't necessarily want to have to rely so much on Newark and LaGuardia and JFK and all of the hassles that those big airports have. Let's send them to a smaller airport like Trenton, and we can give them a more satisfying experience at one of those smaller airports. Well, now Trenton turns out to be one of the airports where the air traffic control is going to be shut down. So you've got these big carriers like Frontier dealing all of a sudden with dealing blind, essentially.
That's true. And for an air carrier, I think it's an item of specific concern when you talk about days where the weather is less than ideal. On those days when they actually are flying in instrument conditions in the clouds with limited visibility, at an airport without a tower, only one airplane is allowed to make use of the approaches that get you down through the clouds and onto the ground at a time. And all the other airplanes end up holding or being spaced or delayed on their way to the airport. When we look at a situation like that, air carriers are subject to schedules. Their passengers get very unhappy if they can't meet those schedules. And as we start to see weather delays at these untowered airports, I think we're going to have a lot more backup, a lot more customer dissatisfaction. And it's a real item of concern for carriers.
Yeah.
When we go to an airport.
And are untowered airports more susceptible to weather delays? I assume that if there's a blizzard or so on, I mean, you need to have line of sight in order to land at an untowered airport, don't you?
Well, there are instrument approaches to untowered airports at many of the airports, but it's a question of capacity, right? At a towered airport, we can have several aircraft on the way in, following the instrument approach procedure to get into that airport. When we get to an untowered field, because there's no one on the ground directing traffic, making sure that the planes have safely landed and there's nothing obstructing the path, we have to limit the number of planes that come down on that approach. So you end up in a holding pattern, essentially flying out, waiting for the first airplane to take its turn, and then the radar controllers start to sequence the planes in one at a time, which can cause a lot of delays.
And when there's no air traffic control, is it just a first come, first served, essentially, as to who can land in what order?
It is. Pilots have to work it out among themselves. Frequently, it's done by radio calls and proximity to the airport. Many pilots are thinking ahead as to the relative speeds of the airplanes coming in. A historic airplane from the 1930s that may be flying 90 or 100 miles an hour is probably not going to get to the airport anywhere near as fast as a modern twin that's moving at almost double that speed. So pilots take that into account, and they basically work it out themselves using both tactics to see and avoid other traffic and by communicating on radios most of the time to organize the traffic.
Robert Poole, I want to get you in here. I know that you're the Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation. What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong in all this?
Well, I think the sequestration, particularly as it affects the FAA, is a gigantic political failure. I mean, air traffic control, the infrastructure for aviation in the United States, is an essential service that in no way should be subject to across-the-board government cutbacks. And the ironic thing is that the United States is the last developed country in the world that where this kind of thing can happen. If you go to Canada, that this could not happen. There could not be a government budget cut across the board of air traffic control. Could not happen in Australia, could not happen in New Zealand, could not happen in the UK or Germany or Switzerland. All of them they've insulated their air traffic systems from the government budget and made them self-supporting and run, in effect, as a nonprofit business, many times government corporations, but they're completely outside of the national government's budget, and they're depoliticized. They're not subject to being something that can be tossed back and forth as a political football in the nation's capital.
Do those systems get funded by the government, or do they get funded by fees on airlines?
They get funded by fees. It's like a utility. Like you pay your electric bill, you pay your air traffic bill. And this has worked very, very well. This trend has been going on for the past 25 years. It started in 1987 with New Zealand. And that was actually the New Zealand experience was an inspiration for the Clinton administration, which proposed a nonprofit government corporation funded by charges to the users and able to issue revenue bonds for large capital projects like the current NextGen. that would be insulated from politics.
And just, sorry to interrupt, but just clarify for us, when you say users, are you talking about the airports themselves, or are you talking about
No, we're talking about the people who fly planes and get the actual services,
right.
which would be mostly, by and large, mostly the airlines.
Yeah.
Business jets would pay something. In Canada, the private planes pay about $68 a year as an annual, essentially a membership fee to gain access to controlled services. This really works, and these companies have investment-grade ratings when they go into the bond market because, air traffic is a growing business. It's easy to finance these things on a long-term basis if you have a revenue stream that the politicians can't play around with and screw up.
It always strikes me that when we look at the size of government in the United States versus in other rich countries, the refrain in the US is always for a leaner, more efficient government and let the private sector do it where it can. And then when you stumble up against things like this, you hear this madness that all of these supposedly socialist-style countries like my homeland of Australia and New Zealand and Canada are the ones who've implemented common sense free market solutions.
Yeah, even France, as centralized and statist as France is, has a self-supporting air navigation service provider that is insulated from the national government budget. I mean, so this is not rocket science. We have models all over the world for how to do this, but it's never been politically taken seriously in this country. I hope that this is a wake-up call that NATCA, the airlines, all of the aviation community can see the system is really broken, and we need to prevent this from ever being possible again.
And talk to us about the upgrades that are necessary to the air traffic control system in the United States. I know that Europe uses a more advanced system, right? There are some. I once heard a pilot tell me a statistic that I can't verify independently, where he said that we'd be able to get 30% more traffic out of the New York area if we were using the world's best technologies in terms of air traffic control.
Well, Europe is still a long ways from there, and it's kind of a race between the United States and Europe and other countries to
Who's doing it best in your estimation?
Well, I think Canada, in its quiet way, has probably made a lot more progress than most countries in putting in things like satellite-based surveillance by what's called ADS-B and implementing controller-pilot data links so that instead of talking on congested voice frequencies, a lot of messages can be sent back and forth essentially by email. And the pilots see it on a display screen and can say yes or no or whatever. This is still just barely getting started in the United States, but it's well underway in Europe. It's basically just about nationwide as of this year in Canada. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And NextGen, which is the overall name for the U.S. program to modernize and upgrade, is really got a long ways to go, and the funding is very questionable, especially in the climate of future budget cuts.
To what do you attribute the sort of backwardness of the U.S. in this field, if I can put it that way?
Well, in a sense, the United States has always been the leader in aviation, has the largest air traffic and aviation system in the world. It's always thought, well, we don't have anything to learn from anybody else. And for a long time, that might have been true. But I think in the last couple decades, we've seen a lot of good innovations in how to govern and fund an air traffic system in a way that's really proving itself to be workable, and that would have prevented, if we'd had it here, any nonsense like the sequester.
Andy Bender, you're muted, by the way, Andy, so if you could there was some background noise, if you could just unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone button, that'd be great. You grew up in a small town with a small airport. Is there some kind of affection and affinity that little towns have for the viability of their airports?
Yeah, well, yes, there is. I mean, I grew up in the town of New Haven, Connecticut, which is one of the airports that's slated to lose its tower. And for certain, it just makes things a lot easier. You could fly from Los Angeles, where I live, to New York, and then, drive an hour and a half, 2 hours at great expense, or just change planes in Washington or Philadelphia or wherever it was. I think now it's only Philly, and you're right there. You're 10 minutes from downtown. It does make a huge difference.
I just want to show a map here that I've got on my computer of some of these closures. You can see them all over the country, and then obviously you can zoom in and take a look. So we'll put a link to that in the resource well if people want to fiddle around with that and see where the airports near to them are being affected. Andrew, just speak to I raised it briefly with Robert Poole, but just speak to the next advances in air traffic control and what we want to see coming down the pike.
Sure. From my experience, I've been working with the TAMR program, which is focused mainly on terminal automation. So in plain speak, your arrival and departure airports. There's en route, which deals with the in-between spots for radar systems. And we're advancing to satellite-based radar. So this program began in 1996. However, here we are, 2013, much delayed. And I foresee sequestration cuts pushing the schedule out even further.
Yeah. Paul, just speak to us about how the decisions get made about which airports are going to be shut down and which aren't, rather which air traffic control systems at which airports are going to be shut down and which aren't. Who makes the call?
The FAA and their finance department have been working closely, I guess, with the Secretary of Transportation and OMB, and they've been making the determinations. We're not making the determinations. We're just doing everything we possibly can to keep the system growing, keep it thriving. This country does best when we're the world's leader, like Robert said. We run the safest, most efficient, most complex airspace system in the world, and sequestration is changing that very quickly. And when we talk about important programs like Tamara that Andrew's working on, that's needed to move into the next step of satellite-based navigations, and it's part of the chassis to do all of the next-gen programs that we're doing. And unfortunately, sequestration is going to push this back years, which is then going to, we will lag behind the rest of the countries in modernization. Now, as far as the 149 towers, those should be open. They should continue to be open. And the FAA, with stakeholders, should have a BRAC-type policy where they can look at the amount of traffic that's being run into these facilities and to determine the value of the national airspace system and the value of the economy to the local economy, to the state economy. I mean, a lot of these airports are, they are the avenue to interstate commerce from big city to big city. It's these rural towns. And the gentleman from New Haven is exactly right. You used to fly from New Haven to Philadelphia, then go. Now, what your options are, a lot of carriers are not going to fly into uncontrolled airports.
Yeah, and I mean, if this is such a large proportion of the nation's airports, if it's almost 30%, then some of those, it's not like we're only talking about tiny little airstrips. At the larger end of the ones that are being closed, I presume we're talking about airports that have a fair amount of traffic.
We are. I mean, when you talk about 150,000 general aviation operations a year, or less than 10,000, up to 10,000 commercial operations a year, this is a valuable service to this community. And the big hub and spoke system that the airlines use, they fly from a Lynchburg to a Dulles, then to get onto a United plane to go to Europe or to go to the West Coast. That's how the system is run. And when you shut down a Lynchburg, Virginia, you're shutting that community down from air traffic services.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that gets back to what you were saying, Robert Poole, about how essential these things are. It's a part of the infrastructure that shouldn't be susceptible to ongoing budget squabbles in Washington. I mean, what's your feeling? If the sequester gets reversed, are these things going to open back up? Do you think that this is going to be a kind of a line in the sand moment where we might actually get some action to upgrade the entire system?
I'm hoping this will be a time when the aviation community draws together and says, never again. We must redesign the approach to how we run air traffic in this country to make it, to insulate it from political game playing and from these kinds of threats, which really are vitally important to have air traffic in serving all the places that it needs to, and adequately staffed and adequately funded. And the system now is not really sustainable into the future.
Mm. Bob McKenzie, could that be a silver lining here?
I would hope it would be, but I think one of the big concerns that we got to look at is the user fee proposal we've sort of been talking about a little bit here. That has been tossed around for years, and I think it's a fallacy to think that aviation really isn't trying to pull its weight or isn't contributing to the cost of the national airspace system. You look at general aviation, every time somebody buys a gallon of gas or a gallon of jet fuel, they're paying a tax that goes to help support our national airspace system. You look at the commercial side, and there's a head tax on those flights. People are paying to support the system. I think that, if we want to look at how to really grow this thing and make sure that the system is preserved, we have to stop, cutting it every time there needs to be a budget law. We're trying to make up a budget shortfall. we're talking about a safety issue here, and people are thinking, oh, well, this is just an easy place to cut. It's not. It's already funding a huge part of its cost.
Although I must say that when you're an international traveller and you come to the States, one thing that does strike you is how low the taxes are. When you travel domestically in the US. Tom Friedman talks about taking off from Amsterdam Airport and landing at JFK, and it's like going from the Jetsons to the Flintstones. You kind of get what you pay for on this. When you fly. Every time I fly out of Sydney Airport, my hometown airport, they tack $30 or so onto the cost of the ticket, and that goes to it's a private company. The airport is privately owned. They charge you every passenger $30, and it's a good airport. It works. Robert Poole, I imagine that's music to your ears.
Yeah, I mean, you do get what you pay for. And I think on the user fee question, this has been the big hold-up to previous proposals to go to a self-funded air traffic system. Canada proves that you don't have to do this on the backs of general aviation. The single-engine piston planes, as I said, pay less than $100 a year. They don't pay any transaction fees in Canada. This works. They like it. It's not hurt general aviation at all in Canada. Business jets pay a fee that's based on each transaction, but it's tailored to the weight of each plane. So they're only paying a little more than the U.S. business jets pay. And the business jet community loves NAV Canada. They have a seat on the board of NAV Canada. The controllers have seats on the board. It's run basically like a user co-op, in effect, where the stakeholders are the ones calling the shots, deciding on the policies, deciding what makes sense, where the next investment should go. And it's not, none of this is earmarked by the Canadian Parliament. It's not, they don't play any budget games because it's hands-off completely. It's insulated from all of that.
It is.
And run by and for the users in their interest. And I think if that's doable there, it ought to be doable here. Not a carbon copy, but we need to take the best principles from that and adapt them to a system that works for the United States.
It is always awe-inspiring to me to see just how many disparate areas Washington can screw up from. You never underestimate Washington's ability to really find many, many ways to screw everything up. But thanks to all of you for being part of this conversation and filling us in on this latest little screw up. You can find interesting links to resources and articles about this in the resource. Well, you can be part of the conversation, of course, by clicking our red Be an On-Air Guest button, and the conversations will continue here on HuffPost Live.